We are here. We are back. It's been almost, I don't know, it's probably been like 9 months since we've done a
Yeah,
video, right? Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Uh, Last year, if you're unfamiliar, Aubrey and I did a series of about 5 or 6 videos detailing some of the longer term transits that we collectively are going to experience, that we are experiencing, which include Neptune in Aries, Uranus in Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius, and the current nodes in Pisces and Virgo. We will probably do another one on Leo Aquarius nodes at some point in the next month or so. But for the purposes of this video, we are going to talk about Saturn in Aries. So, Aubrey, I'm very excited to have you here, as always, to be a part of this experience with me. I think we always have fun together, you know?
Yeah, we definitely do. Always excited to record with you. I love you, obviously.
Oh
So,
my God, I love you too. So, thinking a little bit about maybe the best place to start, as we usually do, is the talking about Saturn in Aries, or the transit that we're exploring from just a very contextual, point blank astrological view. So, in your opinion, or if you have, some thoughts, like what does Saturn and Aries in general represent in your mind or to you?
well, okay. I think like the first thing we have to touch on is the fact that Saturn is in its fall in
Hmm.
Aries. So what that means whenever a planet is in its fall or detriment, it means that the sort of themes or motivations of that planet, in this case Saturn, and the themes and motivations of, in this case, Aries, is kind of a mismatch, right? They
Hmm.
can feel kind of like fundamentally opposed to one another. And so anytime a planet is in its fall or detriment, it's thought to kind of have a harder time in that sign, a more difficult time kind of expressing itself the way that it wants to, accomplishing the things that it kind of wants to. And is sort of thought to be, like ill at ease, or just uncomfortable in general there. So, when we are thinking about what that means for Saturn and Aries, whenever we're thinking about Saturn, this is the planet that rules over systems, structures, rules, regulations. We tend to kind of point to like the government and the powers that be, and all of our sort of like socio-political structures that exist. And Saturn does very much like to think about things on this kind of like bigger, more societal level. Whereas when
Hmm.
we think about Aries, this is the cardinal fire sign of the zodiac. It is the first sign of the zodiac. And it is ultimately the sign of the self or the individual. And so Aries is not thinking about things on a societal level at all. It is instead very focused on itself, its own kind of wants, needs, and desires. And that's kind of the place that Aries likes to operate from. So
Hmm.
when we bring these two energies together, it's a very interesting mix, and therefore brings this very interesting energy forward. Um, if you are somebody who was born with your natal Saturn in Aries, you will be entering your Saturn return for the next like 2.5 years. Well, closer to like 2 years, right? We
Hmm.
decided that March of 2028 when it leaves. So you had your first, we all had our first preview of Saturn in Aries last year, especially in July and August. And then on September 1st, it re entered Pisces.
Hmm.
And it is now wrapping up its time there. We've got about 9 days left during this filming until it is gone. So, anyways, um, that's the kind of influence, right, that we're carrying forward individually and collectively for the next 2 years is really kind of thinking about like, what does it mean for Saturn to kind of be struggling to do the things that it wants to do?
Yeah, I can agree with a lot of this. I think, Saturn takes about 2.5 to 3 years to transit through a sign. So, like Aubrey was saying, we got a taste of it from May 24th of last year to September 1st.
Mhm.
And we can look at that period of time and get a peek into what we might see come back around, or what we might experience in some way over the next 2 years as we deal with kind of the ongoing Saturn in Aries. I think, you hit the nail on the head around like government and structures and things kind of changing with rules and regulations. I think about Saturn and its relationship to higher authority, but then I think about Aries, which is the sign of the rebel and the sign of
Mhm.
the leader, right? And Aries finds exaltation in the sun, which is another planetary energy around the authority,
Mhm.
right? But it's a different kind of authority. And so when we see Saturn in Aries, it is the bucking against authority or rewriting or reimagining rules around authoritarian structures or governments or parliaments that were put into place previously. Some of the things that we will explore is how oftentimes in history Saturn in Aries has destabilized previous governments and established new ones, not necessarily to that, sometimes to a big degree, but not always to a major degree, right? And we can also see how over time, because Saturn is a planet that affects things through time, space, and energy. It's not something that always happens overnight. Over time, we will see how Saturn in Aries creates a decentralization of power around a certain group or authority figures as well. So it may take larger, longer cycles. And when we talk about some of these cycles, like the UK, England, um, come to mind in particular because they've had a lot of Saturn and Aries experiences where their power continued to diminish, continues actually even to diminish, possibly even into the UK potentially separating back into right its own buckets and not actually being centralized in the way that it is now.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah,
So,
definitely. I think, traditionally, well, both when we think of Aries as being ruled by Mars and then thinking about the more like traditional um, associations of Saturn, both of those kind of deal with this idea of separation,
mhm,
right? And so we see this separating of people from well-established groups. We see a separating, as you said, kind of on this like governmental level. And sometimes it's major and sometimes it's not, but that's
yeah,
kind of also, the general theme. We didn't talk about this too much prior to the video, but we did before that we also like divorce was kind of this like theme that we first saw emerging
mhm.
underneath Saturn and Aries as well. So again, that kind of separation that we see people undergoing.
Absolutely. And Saturn is considered traditionally a malefic, and
Mhm.
Aries is traditionally also ruled by Mars, which is a malefic, and they each have their own energy around this. Separation, I think, is a really good word to use because Aries shows us where we can separate from the group or from relationships into autonomy or individuality, where we can take a stand on
Mhm.
something, whether it's popular or unpopular. We'll talk about like how there were some like historical like civil unrest or like certain protests that were done during particular events that were not necessarily seen as popular at the time,
Mhm.
but in true Saturn fashion, as time goes on, these things also become more popular or more accepted in the cultural zeitgeist.
Yeah.
So, okay. So when we think about Aries, Aries is very much so the pioneer. So I think a really good place to start is to think about the entrepreneurial energy that Aries can bring positively into Saturn's realm, right? So
Mhm.
this is a good opportunity for us to establish new frameworks, new foundations, new structures, new ideas. We're coming off the tails of Saturn and Pisces, where we're dissolving boundaries, where we're dissolving structures that no longer work for us. And Aries says, okay, well, what do we want to do now? How do we go the uncharted territory? How do we go our own way? How do we create pathways that make more sense future forward or even make sense to me right now while knowing that they'll be flexible? Saturn and Pisces taught us about flexibility and how that's a form of formidability. And now Saturn and Aries will be about initiation and like
Mhm.
how we can start things to become formidable in the long term.
Mhm.
Um, Back before Saturn entered Pisces, one of the things that I felt very deeply about this was that it would bring disappointment, and disappointment is a point of opportunity, right? I talked a lot about this in the past few years, how Saturn in Pisces dissolved the illusions of things that we thought we wanted or that we desired. And we got really disappointed by that. It also showed us where we didn't have control and where we needed to surrender, and how we can make peace and amends with that, and how new opportunities or new things arise as a result of allowing those things to dissolve.
Hmm.
I believe Saturn in Aries is going to be about the construction of anger, right? How do we move through rage, anger, passion, and courage, right? How do we make a relationship to these emotions, to these feelings, to these experiences in a way that is beneficial in true Saturn form, beneficial to many or beneficial to all in some capacity? I don't know. Do you have a thought around that?
No, I mean, I agree with you. When you first brought that up, I was like, wow, like it just really resonated with me. I remember like reading your first post you made about it, and I was just like, yes, like
Mm-hmm.
100%. And I think to your point that you were making earlier, that maybe isn't a super popular
Mm-hmm.
idea, right? People kind of hear those words like anger, hatred, all of that, and they're kind of like, whoa, slow your roll there. We
Mm-hmm.
have enough of that already. But those are all natural parts of the human
Emotions.
experience, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
all experience those feelings at one point or another in our life. And I think especially in this kind of moment that we find ourselves in, especially in like the Western world, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
here in the United States and in Europe and whatever, where we're seeing this huge rise and division, right? This huge like cultural division around like the fascism that's happening here in the
Mm-hmm.
United States and things like that. There is so much anger and hatred that's kind of like bubbling, in
Mm-hmm.
my opinion, kind of coming to this like tipping point or whatever. And as people are wanting to dismantle the current like powers that be here in the United States, and across other countries in Europe, but we live here in the States, so why we're talking about the States, right? So we're wanting to dismantle that. We have to figure out what to do, right,
Mm-hmm.
with all this anger and hatred and fear, and how can we have a more constructive Saturn, right,
Mm-hmm.
productive Saturn relationship to those things, and how can we channel that kind of anger and courage and all of those things in a way that can be sustainable, which is always what like Saturn's asking of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to channel it into something that will benefit the rest of us in the long run.
I love that. I think about the what individually makes us angry and how that can add to or lead to collective action, right? Because we are not isolated in our feelings or ideas around what we hate or what makes us angry, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot of rules, regulations, and legislation being passed based on hatred, right? But then there's also hatred to that hatred, right?
Right.
And so this is the historically Saturn in Aries has been a point of fighting back,
Yeah.
right? And where the people are emboldened to take back control and power. So sometimes when we say things on the individual level, we're also speaking about them as the collective, seeing how the people are the individual versus, let's say, like the government or the structures or the entities or the authority as well. So I just want to also kind of create that framework that, Aries can focus on the self, but it can also focus on the collective self. Like, how do we see ourselves reflected in each other? And how do
Hmm.
we create, which also feels like the opposition to Aries, which is Libra, right? And so there's some of that energy coming through. But then, like, how do we also create rules or regulations or establish new frameworks that support that energy too, like that support
Hmm.
us seeing each other reflected in one another, or a protection as well, because Saturn can also be a point of protection in
Yeah,
my eyes.
absolutely. No, I completely agree with that.
So some of the big things historically, and I'm just going to touch on a few points here, and we can talk about the big picture ideas around them. But historically, through Saturn and Aries, so keep in mind these are about 3 year periods in history, and about every 30 years. So it'll be 3 years, then about 29 to 30 years later, another 3 years, and so on and so forth. So some historical events, Saturn and Aries coincided with the start of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution happened or started in 1789, I believe, 1790 was the year that Saturn entered Aries. So it was kind of the ongoing, on rolling, and the
Hmm.
establishment of the French Republic and the trial of Louis the XVI all happened under Saturn in Aries. So there's this, and we'll talk about a few others. There's this vibe of like no kings or like
Yeah.
no royalty or like the dismantling of monarchs as well. There was a trial for Mary, Queen of Scots, around the attempted assassination of Elizabeth I in the Western world, in the UK in particular, that happened as well under Saturn and Aries transit. There was the Spanish Civil War and the rise of Franco, as well as the rise of Mussolini during a Saturn in Aries. It was the dismantling of the government with the establishment of another government, right?
Hmm.
And this is about the people's power versus the authoritative power kind of coming into mix. This was when Stalin began to consolidate power. So we're looking at like 1937 to 1940, Saturn and Aries. This was when we started to see Hitler taking like direct control of Austria in 1938. So not necessarily that like Saturn and Aries brings fascism, but it can be the power hungry, you
Hmm.
know? Additionally, we saw, um, in other Saturn and Aries time frames, like the assassination of political leaders or people who had political influence. So, if we go back to 1967 to 1969, we're looking at the assassinations of MLK Jr., JFK, and RFK,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Just here in the US alone. And then we're also looking at the kind of like civil and political unrest happening, right? Around like race riots, race relations, right? Civil rights movements continuing on forward. We're in the middle of the Vietnam War as well. Something that we'll talk about in the Saturn Neptune conjunction, which we did talk about in Neptune and Aries, but we'll touch on it in this video as well, is that the last Saturn Neptune conjunction in the 50s, not the last, but one of the ones previously in the 50s, the US was caught up in the Korean War. And then during Saturn in Aries, we did not learn our lesson and we were caught up in the Vietnam War. Of course, all of our doing in the US. And then there were in 96 to 99, we saw the separation or divorce of Diana from Charles and then her death. We saw the separation of Ireland from the rest of Great Britain, right? The UK kind of creating its own entity, with the Good Friday Agreement being signed during Saturn and Aries. We had the recognition of former Soviet countries in establishing their own identities, right? Because this
Hmm.
came just on the heat. This came like 7 years after the Soviet Union dissolved, which is also a Saturn Neptune conjunction thing that we'll talk
Hmm.
about.
Yes, it is.
Peak at Russia. Hong Kong was given back to China. Scotland created its own kind of parliamentary power, and Wales did the same thing. So, one of the things, again, it's the decentralization of power. It doesn't always equal fascism. Sometimes it's calling back the power to the people or the sovereign nation or the sovereign people, from whatever the bigger authoritative entity happens to be. So, that was a lot, right,
Yes,
that
it
I just
was.
ran through.
Yes, it was. But a lot of those are really great examples to demonstrate, what we're kind of talking about in the very beginning, where we're like, yeah, it's this like changing around the government, right? It's this changing around the power. And I think you put it beautifully when you said the decentralization of power, right?
Mhm.
Because that really is like what is happening one way or another, right?
Mhm.
Across all these examples. I also think that kind of like diversity around the examples is important too, because One thing that I find that people kind of like get stuck on with transits is like, oh, this is what it was back then, so it's only going to show up this one way. And it's like, that's not true, right? Like there are myriad examples of any planetary position, any transit, and especially over a longer period of time, such as with Saturn, it can and is or
Hmm.
will be like all things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, one of the things that I feel that we really want to showcase here is the diversity of experience. We'll talk about art and culture and music as well. Like this isn't only going to be about world history, but I think it's important for everyone to see like, okay, so these things are going through their Saturn return, right? So these are things to pay attention to. These are things to watch, right? Like what's going to happen in Italy, let's say, right, with Meloni and her own fascist right wing ideology, right? This has happened in Italy before with the rise of Mussolini during a Saturn and Aries transit. But then you have like certain places going more opposite realm or route too, where we have, let's say, let's use Spain as like an example, which has more of like a leftist government versus the fascist government that they had in like a previous Saturn and Aries transit. So again, this is the conversation that Saturn teaches us different things over time, and sometimes it takes time for either we have to relearn the lesson or not learn the
Yeah,
lesson, right? Um, in the previous establishment of like all these fascist governments, the U.S. necessarily was not actually. We
right.
established a lot of social programs that we still use today, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So like that was a lot. That was a lot through FDR and creating like safety nets for the American people, right? Well, this time around, a lot of those things are getting what dismantled, right, or taken away, um, or reformed or reviewed as well. But again, going back to this idea of like no kings, no royalty, no monarchs, anyone who tries to establish themselves as a supreme ruler, Saturn in Aries is not about that
Yeah,
life, right? It is the rebel. So we are going to rebel against the things that feel supreme or where we're under the thumb of something.
totally.
So some of the other things that kind of happened during Saturn in Aries that I think is really interesting and something to keep our eye on is the euro. So the
Hmm.
European Central Bank and the euro were created during Saturn in Aries. So they're both about to enter their Saturn return. So
Hmm.
go back to Saturn dealing with like structures, right? And like this was about a unification. So like decentralizing maybe people's individual
Hmm.
currencies and making them fall under a major currency to have better buying power, let's say.
Yeah. I think also keeping in mind too that like the establishment of the EU was in direct response to Hitler, right? And direct response to World War II. And they were like, we have to come together and sort of, I'm going to call it centralizing, right,
Mm-hmm.
our power, so that no one person can kind of like rise and do the thing, right,
Mm-hmm.
that like Hitler did. And then, obviously later down the road, then we had the euro come in, right?
Yep.
And then we had the establishment of the European Central Bank and all the things like that. So it is a very interesting moment as far as all of that is concerned, because we are seeing these kind of like alt-right movements rise in like Germany and France and I don't even know where else. Okay, but
Portugal, yeah.
right.
Italy, yep.
Right. And so Europe, I think, is kind of taking that, well, hopefully they're taking that active role in trying to squash that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
trying to move away. And so it'll be interesting to see how the euro and like kind of comes into play in that realm as well.
Absolutely. I also think a little bit about like the exposure of things, right? So during Saturn and Aries, we have often, this is kind of like a segue away from the euro. So I just want to be clear. Um, like what happens when we become like overexposed. So I think about like
Mhm.
Diana and like the paparazzi chasing her to her death, essentially, like that overexposure. But then we can also take that overexposure and look at um, a lot of people post World War II, a lot of Nazis or fascists ran away to the global American South. So we're looking at like
Right.
South America.
Hmm.
So Argentina, Brazil, Peru, to seek out safe havens, and then how potentially the global American South is going to, undergo their own changes through Saturn and Aries. I think about how Trump has tried to destabilize Venezuela,
Yeah. Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And not saying that, again, that is a fall of a dictator, yes. And I know it's a
Hmm.
very complicated situation, and I am no expert around that, but I just want to call attention to this idea of like the fall of, right, these
Yeah.
supreme powers, supreme leaders coming
Hmm.
forward. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that also continues to be established. I'm curious about Cuba also, right? I think about Argentina and his relationship to Trump and how he's very Trumpy, right?
Mm.
In the president of Argentina. So like also seeing, will those powers decentralize as well? And then, can we start to see the power being brought back to people, and like what is it going to take?
Yeah.
I think about here in the US, obviously there's been a lot of protests, right,
Hmm.
against what's happening in our country. It's worth noting that, also speaking of exposure, or sleuthing and exposure, the FBI was created under Saturn and Aries. So I think there's a lot to think about around that. But the FBI, its purpose, right, was to protect, like have a centralized whatever to protect people. But it's not always been the
I
case.
think it's also interesting actually to think about that because Kash Patel is such an unpopular figure, right? And he's the current
Hmm.
director of the FBI. And everybody talks about how sort of like ineffective he is, or how he's just like fumbling the bag when it comes to like, a lot of these investigations and stuff that the FBI is supposed to be involved in. And so, this will be a Saturn return for the FBI. So actually they are maybe one to watch as well here in the States, around that stuff. So yeah, very interesting. And also civil unrest, right? As like that kind
Hmm.
of other theme we really saw when we were looking back through history. The protests of the Vietnam War, for example. Obviously, we're experiencing plenty of, increasing civil unrest here in the United States. Um, so yeah, that I mean, we'll see. But yeah.
Well, and I think about the creation of like new government entities under Saturn and Aries, right?
Mhm.
Or we'll talk about gun reform in a minute, but like new laws that are being put into place. So like the FBI was created. We saw like the decentralization of certain powers and countries taking back sovereignty over themselves. But then, unfortunately, here in the US, we also have like government entities that have been created that we also don't align with, things like ICE, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And how like force and violence, very Aries type things, are being used to enforce rules and regulations that, again, the people do not agree with,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Um, if we go back historically as well, and we think about some of the other things that have happened around, like the Race Relations Act, which criminalized discrimination, right, in the UK, along with the Commonwealth Immigration Act, restricting rules on who could live and not live in the country. We also
Mhm.
had Thomas Paine writing about the rights of man, where basically it is said, and I'll read it right here, arguing that political revolution is permissible when the government doesn't protect the natural rights of the people, right? So then the Declaration of Rights of Women, female citizens were written by the French during this time, and the Vindication of Rights also of women were published during this time. So as much as it is about the creation of things that we maybe don't always agree with, or opinions that are unpopular, can also be about things that set us up for the long term, not in this case ICE, but in historically thinking about like the rights of man, right?
well, and I think like to your point also of like Aries just pointing to like new, fresh,
Hmm.
whatever, like all of these things, popular or not, they're new things, right, that are being established at that kind of governmental societal level. So
Hmm.
I think we will see plenty of that, over the next 2 years, worldwide, right? Like not
I
just
think so
here.
too. And I think we will see the response to what does not resonate with the people, right? Us as individuals, the collective. Like where do we no longer feel connected to what is happening? And then like what is our power? How does our anger and our hatred and our courage and our passion bubble up to get us to mobilize to do something,
Hmm.
right? To
Hmm.
have a bigger
Exactly.
impact. If we also go back even further in history, and I'm not going to, bore everyone, there's been a lot of cycles around Saturn and Aries and like religious freedom,
Hmm.
right? So, like the
Hmm.
Catholic Protestant, sort of like the Reformation, the back and forth, Catholics being persecuted, right? Christians being persecuted, Muslims being persecuted. There's a lot of this. And so, we're all trying to establish our own individual beliefs as something that can be a part of Saturn, the collective, that can have as much bearing weight or a pillar of support that creates protection and safety within the collective. So it's about how our individual preferences and our differences actually can support one another, not
Hmm.
disenfranchise each other.
I love that. I love that a lot.
Okay. So I think one of the things that we both noticed during Saturn and Aries, I'm going to start with this, and it's that the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment were ratified during Saturn in Aries. Okay. So we hear all about the Second Amendment all the time, right? It's, a well regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state and the right of people to keep and bear their arms shall not be infringed. Right. We hear this all the time.
Yeah.
Historically, in the last 100 and however many years, Saturn in Aries has dealt with gun reform or gun regulations.
Yeah.
So I'm going
Yeah.
to rattle off a few. With We had FDR sign the Federal Firearms Act into law that banned people like felons from owning firearms. Okay. This was during 1938. In 1939, the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional for that to happen. Okay. In 67 to 69, as a result of the assassinations of MLK Jr., RFK, and JFK, we see the creation of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the banning of certain people being able to have access to guns, and the Gun Control Act of 1968. And then separately, we saw governments banning weapons or banning guns as a way to disenfranchise people, in this case, like Black Panthers, who were using weapons as a form of protection for people.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so Ronald Reagan, the terrible person that he is, forever one of the worst presidents in the United States history, I will
Yeah.
stand on that.
Hmm.
May he rest in piss. The deliberately targeted Black Panthers around certain gun reform. It was under the guise of gun reform, and it was actually supported by the NRA, which
Hmm.
talks about like the racism there. Then we also had Saturn and Aries 96 through 99, and we had gun control in the UK and Australia following two major massacres happening in both countries, where the UK enacted two laws that effectively banned private ownership of guns. And in Australia, they banned many types of guns and created other protections against guns. There was also a study published under the UN around the International Study of Firearm Regulation. And we also had the National Instant Criminal Background Check System created in the US during Saturn in Aries, which is used as a clear manifestation to establish a boundary around attaining a weapon. So, historically speaking, Saturn in Aries has brought boundaries, rules, regulations, and reform to weapons,
Yeah.
firearms,
Weapons.
and
Yeah.
guns.
Yep. So obviously, I think we can expect to see that again. I mean, we see themes of that right now, right? Thinking about like the violence that's happening in Minneapolis with ICE killing citizens, and then Trump coming out and being like, you're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. You can't have these guns because A, B, C, whatever, going directly against the Second Amendment in the Constitution. Right. And like now, also in response to the occupation of Minnesota, the protesters, people that are like, get the hell out of here, it's people carrying guns.
Hmm.
Like people have started to show up with all kinds of guns, right? Not just handguns. They've got
Hmm.
ARs and all kinds of things to protect themselves, right? So similarly to kind of what you were saying around how the Black Panthers were utilizing guns as a form of protection and to protect people, we're literally seeing that same thing emerge in Minnesota. Also, I don't know about you, but I have seen this kind of joke circling around the internet that's like, oh, the liberals got guns in the divorce. Like, who would have thought that that would have happened? But I mean, absolutely. I think between Trump saying all this weird bullshit about who can have guns, who can't, ISIS, everything horrible that they're doing across this country, and people responding by being like, actually, we have our own guns, right?
Hmm.
Like, I absolutely think that there will be something, some kind of reform, for lack of a better way to put it, around that.
Yeah, but it
Um,
will be, if it's under the current regime, it will be selective reform,
yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah.
It'll be
100%.
exactly what Ronald Reagan did to the Black Panthers,
Yeah.
where it was targeted and, you know, not necessarily beneficial.
No,
Um,
I agree.
but it is true, it's interesting. Like, I think the Second Amendment in and of itself is going to have maybe a review during
Yeah,
this time.
definitely. I think so too.
Um, I do think that I think the interpretation of the Second Amendment. So I think the Second Amendment has gone through many Saturn returns, which is why it's constantly getting iterated with new ideas and regulations and rules. And I think another establishment of that interpretation is coming
I agree.
across both sides of the political divide in the U.S. But I think people are recognizing, in terms of like Minneapolis, that they are exercising their
Hmm.
Second Amendment rights actually by protecting themselves against the government institution that is trying to harm them, i.e., the Gestapo, i.e., ICE.
Which is the whole reason the Second Amendment exists, by the way. It is for
Hmm.
you to be able to defend yourself against the government, right? To
Hmm.
be able, that is not, serving you or doing what it's need to be doing or whatever. And I think that that is like an important thing to kind of underline when we're thinking about like Saturn and Aries, gun reform, the Second Amendment, etc. Because I think what is going to happen is that people who are on this kind of like, left side of the political spectrum who historically are the ones that are kind of crying out for gun reform all the time and sort of, historically being against guns. I think I mean, I'm on the left side of the political spectrum. I think our relationship to guns and the sort of sentiment around that is going to change greatly because I think
Hmm.
it will be almost this like reclaiming of that like original meaning of the Second Amendment and people recognizing like oops, we can't trust our government. Like, you know what I
Hmm.
mean? But ideally also at some point when we have a regime change, um, maybe that is also where we see that reform come in around like gun control
Hmm.
and all those things. But yeah, that was very interesting to kind of uncover
Hmm.
before we started this video. And it was just like, wow, like, but it
Yeah.
makes sense, right? You think of like Aries and Mars and weapons and war and all of those things. And then Saturn coming in being like, we need rules around this and we need control and we need structure. So yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
Well, you think
I
about
also
Aries.
wonder actually, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I actually also wonder if, on almost like a bigger scale, if we will see reform around other kinds of weapons,
I was just about to
right?
say that.
Okay, you're right. So you think
Yeah.
about like nuclear weapons, biological weapons, but also the oh my God, I can't remember the name. There is like a big, it's like a speaker. that they use at protests to try to like disperse the crowd, but
Mm,
it's ruled as being like, inhumane and illegal because of the damage that it can cause to
mm,
people's hearing. And then there's been all of those news stories coming out about the chemicals that ICE is using
mhm,
against civilians and that it being like poison.
mhm.
So I would not be surprised if we ended up seeing more, not just on a national level here in the States, but also like an international approach around, different weapons and the rules of war, rules of engagement. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
real thing too. Hmm.
I agree. And I think, I was going to say like Mars has a relationship to like explosives, right? Sharp objects, things like this.
Hmm.
Aries rules the face and the eyes as
Yeah.
well, and the head. So thinking about like Saturn and Aries and like, what protections, I'm actually going to segue a bit into like sports
Mm.
because because I'm feeling like an adjacent thing here where there's like what protection around like face do we need to have further in certain sports brings me back to ice and being masked, right?
Mm.
Unidentifiable, right?
Yes.
Like where is protection right and where is protection not right, and where people are arguing about semantics versus actually dismantling,
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The enforcement.
Okay, but this is interesting. We didn't like uncover anything around this, but I do wonder how Saturn and Aries is related to like rules and regulations around sports as
It
well.
totally will be.
Like I think about like, you know, the helmets that football players wear, but they all have these horrible TBIs,
Yeah.
right? And like it just ends up like, oh my God, ruining so many of their lives in the long run. So I wonder if there will be something around that where it's like, they need more protective gear around their head or something.
More, I think Saturn and Aries will bring rules and regulations around combat sports and
Yeah.
contact sports.
Right.
But I also think how sport can be, and it's funny when I talk about trends. I was talking to a stylist a month ago, and I was talking to her about how do not sleep on sports as a way, or like people who play sports or athletes as trendsetters,
Mm,
because these are people who have consistently set trends and will
absolutely.
continue to, and like how sports events will also create different trends within the zeitgeist, like the Olympics. But what I was
Hmm.
going to say is we also can't sleep on a more political sense how sports can be around taking a stand politically for
Hmm.
different things. So back in 1968, during the Mexican Olympics, there were a few African athletes who rightfully protested for Black power and rights. So it
Hmm.
was interesting, like how they used that platform, how they personally chose to use that platform as themselves as immensely great athletes to also stand up for what they believe in. This feels very Saturn and Aries to me.
I agree. I totally agree.
So I will be interested. I think about how we in the US are about to host FIFA potentially, right? If it actually works out, yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
But I live in New England, very close to Boston, and it's supposed to be around the Boston area, actually south of Boston. But there's like a lot of energy being put into it
Yeah.
around here already. And so like watching how like stylistically, how a city and like landscape and structures are going to change as a result of a sporting event, just like the Olympics has done previously in other major sporting events too. But yes, going back to your point, there will be rules and regulations around sports that are going to change fundamentally.
But this also makes me think about how they were like wanting to send ice to the Olympics in Italy to like, I don't know what. And then Italy was like, absolutely not, right? And so again, kind of like using that
Mhm.
sports platform to stand up for what they think is correct. I mean, like, no, we're actually not going to accept ice like into our country, into this event. So that is an excellent and interesting point, Anthony. Yay.
It's all connected. I'm looking back at, I don't know, for some reason I was thinking about the Atlanta Olympics because I thought it happened during Saturn and Aries, and it did. And one of the things that came up during this time was there was an Olympic park bombing.
Okay.
So explosives, right? Bomb exploded in the park, killing one person, injuring 110 on July 27th during the Atlanta Summer Olympics. So
Okay.
you know, it makes me think about, and Saturn was not in Aries during this time, but it does make me also think about like the Boston bombing, right?
Yeah.
During like the Boston Marathon.
The marathon.
So yeah. So just also paying
And the
attention to how,
Unabomber. And the
yeah,
Unabomber.
right. And like how major sporting events, because they're gatherings of people, can also be targets. So like they can be twofold in very Saturn and Aries sort of ways.
Yeah.
But I do think overall sports are going to have a lot of power and say on what's happening in the culture right now. One of the designers last year that I said to watch coming into Saturn and Aries, I believe it was Saturn and Aries, was Ralph Lauren.
Mm.
And because this is a Saturn and Aries brand, come to find out, they are designing the US Olympic wardrobe for
Okay.
this upcoming Winter Olympics, right? So like the reinvention of Americana. So I'll be curious
Hmm.
to see like what they do, and if they take a stance or a stand or a commentary. Makes me think about the this is being filmed prior to the Super Bowl. So,
Yeah.
we don't know what the Super Bowl is going to look like in terms of like the halftime show, but like already that's like about sovereign nation. Oh my God, Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
And
I'm
like
sad.
calling back the sovereignty of Puerto Rico and like giving power back to the people in the way that they deserve it. So like, Saturn won't be in Aries yet, but it may as well be. And not to mention that Bad Bunny is a Saturn in Pisces, also a Pisces stellium. And Saturn
Mhm.
finishing up its time in Pisces during this is like a pinnacle of something that then pushes us into Saturn and Aries. I bet there will be continued organization in Puerto Rico to reclaim their sovereignty.
I 100% agree.
Mm,
100%. And that would make sense around these themes we're talking about, like the decentralization of power and seeing these, like, originally sovereign nations kind of like separating back or calling in, or calling back like more power from the government they kind
mhm,
of like operate under. And I know for a fact that like so many Puerto Ricans are just like, get away from us. Like, we
mhm,
we belong to you or whatever, our colonizers, but like we can't vote in the elections, we can't
mhm.
do like this on the third, we don't have the same rights as you. So absolutely, I 100% agree with that. And actually, I would love to see Puerto Rico just be like, bye. Yeah,
Um, and I know it's far more complicated than that, but
of course.
I,
Yeah, of course.
yeah,
Of course.
but I agree. Um, so yeah, it'll be
Okay, so
interesting.
let's segue.
Pivot.
Speaking of Ralph Lauren, right? Let's
Yeah,
segue into some of the like
fashion.
fashion music. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I have some thoughts here. I have a lot of thoughts here, obviously. For those of you who don't know, a lot of my work is centered around like culture, trend, fashion, and astrology and its historical cycles, and also the political influence that these things have. Like a real
And he's
holistic.
a genius about it, by the way.
Oh
Like
my God,
literally
bye.
everything that he
Stop.
predicts it comes true. So you should just listen to him.
Bye.
It's
Um,
true.
Ugh. But I think that some of the things that we are going to see from a fashion perspective, I obviously talked about how I think Saturn and Aries is going to bring a lot of sports brands forward, specifically Adidas. And I think it has to do with Adidas's connection to Bad Bunny. They've released very special collections. They just released another one.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. And Adidas is not a Saturn and Aries brand, but they are very much that um, like that sports related brand.
Hmm.
So like track pants really becoming a big thing again, tennis shoes really having its moment. So I think one of the things that we're going to see a lot of like Adidas and a lot of like collaborations with Adidas. So brands to watch that are Saturn and Aries: Chanel, Balenciaga, Gap, Ralph Lauren, and Acne Studios. Okay.
Okay. Hmm.
So these are ones that I pulled forward. And we can talk about Pokemon too, because they're about to go through their Saturn return.
Yeah.
And like the rise of like super big video games of like the late 90s and how all of those things are going to have resurgences, along with like music groups like Spice Girls. We'll talk about that too. But thinking about Chanel, was founded during Saturn and Aries, known for, right, very much so its garment construction,
Hmm.
right? It plays into being like timeless, which feels very Saturn to
Hmm.
me. But one of the things is that there's a new designer who has shown up in Chanel who is
Okay.
really changing and shifting their look and making their silhouettes far more modern, more flowy, more unique, like really a breakaway from what the classic Chanel look is going to be.
Hmm.
It's I would actually really encourage people to watch. There was a Chanel fashion show where the whole thing was celestial, and they had like planets and Mars and all of these things kind of like as the backdrop, and there were giant orbs in the runway show. And it
Oh,
also felt like, because I think about like space travel and like space relations also with Saturn and Aries a little bit. Um, so Chanel kind of playing into that theme as well, kind of like out of this world. Balenciaga is very Saturn and Aries to me, always gone their own way, have always done their own thing. Um, and one of the things is that they also just got a new head designer, just like Chanel. Both of them, by the way, started during Saturn and Aries mini transit last year in 2025.
oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Uh huh.
Mhm.
So Balenciaga recently, it was Women's Wear Daily said that the collection was seen as a significant departure from the brand's streetwear focus, which
Mm,
is very Saturn and Aries. Streetwear to me is
really?
very
Okay.
Saturn and Aries. And moving towards a more chic, emotional, architectural version or vision, paying homage to the house's original founder. So changing the look, changing things, Saturn return. Gap. Gap is a really interesting one. It was founded in 1969. And I think Gap is going to have a resurgence, okay, in different
Okay.
ways.
Okay.
During the late 90s, Gap was the it girl again.
A
You
hundred
know,
percent.
everyone had a Gap
Absolutely.
sweat, everyone wanted Gap jeans, Gap this, Gap that. Okay. Also, right before it had its Saturn return, it created Old Navy, which was 1994. Okay, so Old
Oh,
Navy,
really?
so Old Navy is just went through its Saturn return. Okay,
Okay. Okay.
and Old Navy has just had like its own split off. And in the during Saturn in Pisces, Old Navy actually split off from its parent company to create its own publicly traded company.
Wow. Okay.
Hmm. So now I'm really curious to see how Gap fills the gap during their
Yeah.
Saturn return and like which one of the brands comes forward. Is it Athleta because it's the athletic brand? Is it Gap itself and its construction in denim and really like changing its look? Is it Banana Republic, right? Which I think has also had like a big resurgence lately. But
Yeah.
Gap has
I
already
agree
started
with
to
that.
step up. They've already started to step up their marketing efforts, I've noticed. And Gap did a really genius thing in response to the Sydney Sweeney American Eagle ad. And this was during Saturn and Aries, by the way, when this
Yes, it
happened.
was. Hmm.
Hmm. What happened was they took that time, almost immediately turned out a commercial featuring Cat's Eye, which is a diverse Korean band of different body shapes and ethnicities, and talked about how like basically Gap is for everyone, and
I
turned it
do
into like a
remember that
big dance
commercial.
party.
Yes,
Yes.
I do remember that commercial because it was that Sydney Sweeney thing was so explosive, right?
Hmm.
And then I remember Gap's sort of like response to that being almost equally explosive. So interesting.
Well, and you know I'm obsessed with denim because I'm a freaking
Yes.
psychopath.
We can
Um,
see all the denim in your background. Yes.
so the thing about denim in general, it's actually this has nothing to do with Saturn and Aries, but remember when I had like this whole thing around like Pluto and its leg shapes? It's actually like have written a whole article on discussing denim from an astrological lens, and I'll put it in this chat below, like in the notes. But denim in its creation is a Neptune in Aries, which I think is really interesting. Which we're heading into, obviously, like a Neptune
Saturn return.
return. Yeah, well, also like a Neptune return for it. And I was double checking the Pluto. It is also a Saturn in Aquarius, and Pluto is hovering over that Saturn right now.
Really?
Yes. So,
Interesting.
anyways, all of this to say that denim in and of itself is changing, but I think with Gap, like it's gonna have like a resurgence in some way, and I
Mhm.
also think this is very in line with like Gen Z's and later Gen Alpha's obsession with like Y2K in late 90s.
Yes, totally.
Uh huh. So
How
they're
obsessed
absolutely
with that. I
yes.
absolutely agree. Yeah.
So and then so only time will tell, but I do think we're gonna fall into the Gap again.
Gosh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I'll be keeping my eye on that.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And then Pokemon, which you already have seen. There's already been like a couple examples of that.
Oh, I every time I predict something, I so keep in mind, people, I have made a lot of these predictions back in like 2024 and 2025. So every time I see them starting to come up, I'm like, hey, here it is. Hey, here it is.
Yeah.
Hey, here it
Mhm.
is. Um, Pokemon is going to be 30 this year in
Mhm.
2026. So it is in its Saturn return.
Mhm.
And it is everywhere. Like when I tell you, like there's just like like there's going to be a Pokemon commercial during the Super Bowl.
Is there
Okay.
really?
Yes. And they just put out a new game. They're gonna put out a new game in March when Saturn's in
That's
Aries.
so okay. I was just gonna say that. I was gonna say, like, do you think we'll see a new Pokemon game? So there
Yes,
you go.
and the one that's coming out in March is a departure, true Saturn and Aries form, from the types of games that they've created before. It's very Animal Crossing meets Pokemon.
People are gonna love that. Oh my
Oh
gosh,
my
I'm
god,
really
I'm
excited.
like totally gonna be buying that. Are you
That's
kidding?
what I was gonna say. Like, I might play that one. Oh my gosh.
So, and then I also think there's gonna be a lot of Pokemon fashion collabs that we're going to see with both high level brands and low level brands. Uniqlo is one that's already done some.
I could
Um,
see like Black Milk doing something like that.
yes, totally. But like I could even see it being with really super high end brands too. Um, and what if? And I'm just going to say this: what if Gap and Pokemon did something?
That's what
Because
I
they're
was
both
just
in their
thinking too.
Saturn returns.
I can see it. I could totally see it. Like a
And
Gap
so
t-shirt with like a Pikachu on it.
yes, absolutely. I wanted to bring up a few like Saturn and Aries like fashion trends too. So I'm just reading basically right off of what I've written from last year. So people, I'll like I said, I'll include this. But we're going to see the changes in garment construction, angular shapes, deconstructed looks, and silhouettes that challenge the status quo. Move into a break the rules sort of vibe. End of macro trends will continue to die, influenced by Saturn and Aries and Uranus and Gemini. The micro trend is
Mhm.
here.
Mhm.
Focusing on individual desire, personal style will be more and more relevant. We're seeing this happen a lot with accessories. As fashion becomes homogenized, people are craving difference. We're craving
Mhm.
color. We're going to see a lot of color. And this is also because of like the upcoming Jupiter in Leo. But that
Mhm.
I digress. Um,
Mhm.
we're going to see like personal style become more and more relevant and people wanting to separate themselves from how they look from how someone else looks. No one people don't want to look the same. And right now, unfortunately, in mass fashion, everyone looks the same, right?
Totally.
There's no differentiation. Saturn Neptune conjunction happening around Fashion Week will also bring more visual shifts, right? So this upcoming New York Fashion Week happens right around the time that Saturn enters Aries.
Yeah. It's like
Okay.
Valentine's Day weekend, right?
It is. It's literally this upcoming weekend, not this one, but the one after. So I think we're going to see a lot of really new conceptual, different things coming forward. Face stuff like eyewear, like big headdresses, unique headdresses. We're going to see more military, punk, leather, studs, grunge, and hardcore looking elements coming forward.
Which is what
Also,
I'm ready.
yeah, go ahead.
That's
You're
what
ready
I'm
for?
looking forward to. I'm like punk, military inspired,
Mm-hmm.
grunge. Give it to
And
me.
also think about like how military outfits have been used in punk and grunge and like
Totally.
deconstructed. I talked about deconstructed garments. We're going to see a lot of like cutouts, holes, right? Constructions that are very unique and different and angular and sculptural. We're going to see pilot and aviator inspired looks
Mm.
as well. Dramatic shapes, more emphasis near the face and head, unique eyewear, and over construction as well. As much as there's going to be deconstruction, people are going to like be adding elements, adding elements, adding elements to really make it look very different overall. But yes, and red, the color red
Oh
coming up.
yeah,
Very
100%.
Mars colors coming up a
Yeah.
ton.
And no, I completely agree with that. This is interesting to me also thinking about the fact that we are going to have the Saturn Neptune conjunction on the 20th, right?
Hmm.
Which is a once every 36-year transit for those of you who don't
Hmm.
know. But I see so many people, talking about we're craving something new and we're so
Hmm.
sick of the homogenization and like, mental health gray everything and like whatever. And my hope is that this conjunction that's happening is also going to be that kind of spark towards new, right? On the
Hmm.
fashion level, music, arts, I mean, like everything, right? Because I think we're all kind of bored of like the same thing, just like
Hmm.
over and over at this point. So I'm curious, of course, what you think about that. And if you know of any kind of like connections off the top of your head from like the last times we've done
Yeah,
the Saturn Neptune conjunctions.
I'll be interested to see because coming out of the last Saturn Neptune conjunction, like which was in the late 80s, like
89.
89, we started to enter the early 90s, which brought through like heroin chic and like grunge looks. And like,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of like, we're seeing also like Ozempic and like gauntness
True.
continuing, right? So that's something we have to be careful of. I'm thinking a little bit about even like rules and regulations or even the potential of like deregulation around the fashion industry as well with Saturn and Aries, but also the people having like using fashion as a political stance. I mean, that's how it always works, right? But
Mhm.
even more so, like their fashion is speaking to like the times and like really wearing things that are like fuck ice or like whatever.
We're seeing it already. We absolutely
Hmm.
are. Hmm.
We will also see luxury being more focused on reducing production. I think there's something about going back in the archives for luxury
Okay.
brands and pulling them forward. And so that, but like revamping them. So it's like what's old is new, I think will be this Saturn Neptune conjunction. And a lot of
Okay.
DIY is going to be like patchwork,
Love that.
DIY, make it your own, more recycled. Um, as well. And I think back like in the 67, 69, like the patchwork hippie era, right? I think about 96 to 99, grunge, punk, ripped plaids. Plaid will also be a big one. Tartan. Patchwork was also important then. And then like vintage styles coming forward to kind of also create more individualism in style. So I actually think we're going to do more of like what's old is new, but like change the construction of what that old thing is completely.
But I agree with you because I've seen several things recently of, like people on their red carpet moments and whatever, and it's all these celebrities wearing archival pieces, right? Like they're wearing and they're not wearing it in the same way that it was originally presented,
Hmm.
right? Like they're doing something to kind of like modernize it, update it. Yes, maybe make it like a little bit more like in line with their own style. So yeah, I totally agree. I think I think you're hitting the nail on the head here. Yeah.
And I also think the Saturn Neptune conjunction is going to have us continue to degender fashion in different ways, or like see people who were very like women's wear going into menswear, people who are very menswear going into women's wear. Like Bad Bunny during the Grammys were one of the first menswear pieces from Schiaparelli.
Schiaparelli.
Yeah,
So
I know, which is like, but
yeah, with the
yeah,
with the pinched waist
uh huh, uh-huh.
and the
But then like,
corsetry down the back.
but then it was Harry Styles who was wearing, I think, a Chanel top, women's quote unquote Chanel top in presenting album of the year to Bad Bunny.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Uh-huh. We're also going to see a lot of like high low, like really expensive with like really not. I think too. Um, but yeah, I'll I'll link all of the articles that I've written in the notes because I have like extensive thoughts around all of the transits and upcoming trends and predictions and things like that. But I definitely think Saturn in Aries is going to change the game. I mean, the Saturn Neptune conjunction in particular. I'm really curious to see like what these fashion weeks bring out,
Totally.
and then also knowing that like Milan just had their fashion week, and almost immediately right afterward, we're going into the Olympics with Milan as well. So Milan is going to be a place to watch. Want to talk about music quickly?
Sure.
Okay. And I know we talked about wanting to touch on the Saturn Neptune conjunction in terms of Russia, but what I think I might do is include a link to our
No.
Neptune chat where we talk about that
Oh
like
yeah, totally. Yeah.
extensively. So
Yeah.
people can
We
view that
did.
there.
That's true. Yeah, we
Yeah,
did.
we can talk about people can watch that there. But all right, so music, I think about Saturn Neptune ruling music, so the Saturn Neptune conjunction coming up. But last time Saturn was in Aries was the height of like Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera and Destiny's Child and TLC and Spice Girls and NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, right? So it
Hmm.
was like this super hyper pop music realm. Um, and it was very different than the grunge era that preceded it,
Totally. Yeah.
you know? Um, and it was also the beginning of what they called the Latin invasion. So we had like a lot of like Gloria Estefan coming forward. We had Ricky Martin being really popular in the late 90s, right? And so I think about that. And then like now, right, we have
Hmm.
like Carol G, Bad Bunny. Oh my God, I love her. She just put out that album and I'm blanking on her name and I'm so upset about it because I've listened to it nonstop. She's from Spain. And it was like a departure from her normal music, which is typically reggaeton. Please
Oh,
hold.
I have no idea.
Um, oh my, Rosalia. Oh my God, how could I forget that? Rosalia also becoming like really coming out with new music that's very, very different than what she's written before. So, like, we're going to see a lot of this sort of come up. But I wouldn't be surprised if our fave girl and boy bands of the late 90s or like fave artists of the late 90s also have resurgences. Um,
I know. I like that. I am very curious about that. Obviously, we kind of touched on the fact that like Victoria Beckham is in the spotlight right now because of some
mhm,
like family feuds. Okay, but
mhm,
she's a Spice Girl. But it also makes me wonder about like Britney Spears and like, supposedly she's out of her conservatorship, but then we
mhm,
like never hear from her. I don't know. And like, Justin Timberlake from NSYNC obviously had like a very successful individual career. But yeah, I kind of wonder if there'll be like anniversary tours, reunions around that, like in some way.
mhm.
Very interesting.
I'll
Or
be
like,
interested. Go ahead.
I mean, is it even like a resurgence of like the pop star or like girl and boy bands, like even if it's not
Mhm.
them?
For sure. Like I think about, well, you brought up Posh Spice. I want to mention that she's an Aries as well.
Oh,
Um, yeah, bye. And Victoria Beckham just had a documentary put out about her fashion line.
oh, really?
And like, yeah, because she has like actually a very successful fashion line
Yeah. Hmm.
that now probably like is more popular than what her music was in some ways,
I could
you know?
totally see that. Hmm.
And she's the one who's become the most successful, ironically,
Yes.
because she was the one that people always said was the least talented. Um,
Oh, really? I didn't know people
uh-huh,
said that
mhm,
before.
mhm. But anyways, so like yeah, but then like, she's also in the news because of everything going on with her son and like the no contact and like there's a lot of like feud there. Um, it makes me think about Mariah Carey, who's also an
Hmm.
Aries.
And
You
Lady
know,
Gaga.
Lady Gaga. What's going to happen there? There's a lot of musicians that ride the Pisces Aries line, like Lady Gaga, Bad Bunny. Like they all have like placements in either Aries or Pisces. So I'd be really curious to see kind of like what happens with all of them as well through
Okay, but this
this.
is interesting though, because there was just some kind of like tribute to Mariah Carey that just happened. I
It
watched a
was in the
video of
Grammys.
Kesha. Is that what it was? I
It
was
was
like,
at
I
the
watched a
Grammys.
video of Kesha doing like obsessed, and like Okay.
Yeah. So, it's like, but if we also think back to the previous cycle in music, so like late 60s, the Beatles were still at the height of their, you know? So
Really?
like this is although they became popular before Saturn and Aries, it's still like, oh my God, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
I believe there was something around like music censorship also
Oh
that
yeah,
happened
in the
during
United States.
Saturn and Aries. Yeah, it was in the US with it was with the who was the musician? Jim Morrison and the Doors, duh. In the Ed Sullivan show, they were asked to not say a specific word, and they said it anyway, and it caused like a lot. He was basically arrested on stage later that year for indecency. Yeah,
Bye.
and attempting to start a riot, and like there was like a whole conversation around like censorship in music. So it'd be interesting. And actually, during this time, there was a pirate radio in 1967 that was playing popular music from the UK outside of like the publicly broadcasted channels. And so it was outside of the censorship and regulation of them too. So like maybe pirated music gets like,
I would love that.
especially with like the fall of Spotify.
Yes, yes.
We're going to go back to LimeWire.
Oh my God, bye. Somebody call Napster.
Right. Like, well, I even think about like the late 90s and like people really editing and DIYing like their own mixtapes.
Yes, 100%.
Right. And like early in mid 90s too. But like there's very much so that like DIY, creating your own, doing your own thing with music, kind of illegal downloads sort of
Hmm.
situation coming up. So maybe there'll be something around like pirated music too in Saturn and Aries.
Okay, love that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, and then other people that we will probably start to see sort of like fall or change will be like No Doubt. So like Gwen Stefani, she's already started to like have issues, but she was really popular during this time. Like Don't Speak came out during Saturn and Aries. We're going to see continued issues possibly with like the Foo Fighters, right? And he already had sexual harassment allegations put up against him.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Um, we're going to see and I'll also be curious if like any of these artists from like that were popular during Saturn and Aries, whether it was like this late 60s or late 90s, are going to show up in the E-files.
Oh. Maybe, maybe we'll see.
Well, I think about Clinton, who was
Hmm.
president
Hmm.
during that time.
Yes, very true. That's very true.
And our current one, who's all
Yeah.
over them. Uh, yeah. Anyways, I think there will be a lot of changes within the music industry around like bringing back like the hyper pop queen, hyper pop star, maybe like pop bands. Like, it makes me think of like K-pop, like K-pop Demon
Mhm.
Hunters. That was
Oh
really
yeah.
popular during Saturn and Aries last
Yes, it
year.
was. Absolutely. People were obsessed with that.
Yes, and like it like went so far from to like basically they went to the Grammys, right? Like, yeah, they went to the Grammys. They almost won Song of the Year.
Stop it. I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
So I'd be really curious to see like what comes up there. I wonder if there will be new tell-alls or like stuff around like TLC as well, like the
Mm-hmm.
band, because they were really
Maybe like
popular
that's
during
what
this.
we see as like the explosive documentaries or something or the interviews. Like what if Britney, I wish Britney would
Hmm.
do an explosive interview. Hmm.
Um, well, it makes me think about like Tyra Banks. She's about to
Yeah,
put out a
oh my God.
tell-all. Mhm.
When was America's Next Top
You
Model
know,
like?
I'm looking it up right now. I don't think it was the 90s,
I don't think it was either. I think it was like the early 2000s.
but I do believe Tyra Banks rose to popularity during Saturn in Aries. She was the first. Yeah, okay. So in 1997, she received the VH1 Award for Supermodel of the Year. She was the first African
Mhm.
American woman on the cover of GQ and
Mm.
first Black woman on Sports Illustrated, and the cover of Victoria's Secret catalog, and to become a Victoria's Secret angel.
Okay, so there's not like
All,
pioneering first,
all very
like,
Saturn and Aries.
yes.
And so she then is like now trying to change her image again, right? She's going to
I
pioneer. She's
know,
going to go
yeah.
ahead and talk about all the things that she thinks are relevant to America's Next Top Model before, because all their NDAs are expiring.
Oh my God. This is so interesting. I have seen, like the little preview for the documentary and the first like cut they have of her is her being like, I know I took it too far.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, oh God, okay, like we'll see. Because oh my God, I just remember eating up America's Next Top Model. And like I watched every season for a long time, And then at a certain point, I was just like, I can't with this anymore. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
okay,
So,
interesting.
yeah, so I think there's going to be a lot of like tell-alls and exposés. And I talked about this before, exposure, right? Earlier.
Hmm.
So like,
Hmm.
and obviously the e-files are also an expose.
Absolutely.
There's going to be a lot of exposés, friends,
Yes, yes,
under
definitely.
this time.
Oh my God,
Mhm.
so interesting.
Any
Okay,
other
so
thought?
I'm looking forward to that part. The nosy bitch in me is like, yeah,
Also feels
shows
very
up.
like Uranus and Gemini, right?
The goss, like
Yeah.
unearthing the goss. Yeah.
And then of course like the Saturn Neptune conjunction, like destroying the illusion.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Oh my
Um,
God.
all right, my friend. I think, is there anything else that you think is relevant or that you want to bring up before we depart from this?
I don't think so.
Okay. As always, thank you for being here and being a part of this experience. Is there anything you'd like to promote or talk about, or that you have going on? Tell people where to find you, how to book a reading with you.
As always, you can find me on Instagram, Threads, Substack. All three of those are Aubrey, the letter C, which is my middle initial, and then my last name, Houdeshell, which Anthony will write for you in the show notes. And yeah, those are all going to be the easiest ways to like connect with me, book a reading, buy a book, do a thing. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for having me again, Anthony. I
Of
sure love you.
course.
And appreciate our little chats that we do for everybody.
Me too. Me too. And a very Saturn and Aries kind of vibe. Aubrey has Stellar Sex, right? A book around sex and astrology.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
So definitely eat that one up if you can.
Okay, of course.
Okay. But yes, as always, thank you for being here. I will put all of our information in the show notes along with some of the stuff that I talked about in terms of like articles and things that are supportive. So, on that note, have a wonderful, wonderful time, my friends. Bye.